In what could be a pivotal moment for the 2024 presidential race, Kamala Harris will sit for an interview tonight with Baier on Fox News. The interview presents an opportunity for Harris to reach conservative voters, who she hopes to win over. But it also presents risk. Fox News is often unfriendly ground for Democrats, and Baier, while seen as a fair journalist, is likely to press Harris on tough issues. Joining us to discuss this and more, White House columnist Niall Stanage. Niall, how important is this interview for the Harris campaign?
It's definitely a big moment, particularly in this final stretch of the campaign, Drew. And you outlined very well what the risks and the opportunities are for Kamala Harris. She's obviously trying more broadly to reach out to disaffected Republicans and people in the centre ground and a notch or two to the right. And a Fox News interview would be an obvious way to try to further that aim. But things can go wrong. I would not say that the Vice President's performance in the 60 Minutes interview recently was particularly stellar. And so any slip-up or any gaffe would certainly be seized upon by her opponents, including former President Trump.
The Fox interview is part of Harris's media push here in the final weeks of this campaign. It includes traditional and non-traditional media. Yesterday, she sat for an interview with Charlamagne the God. He is an extremely influential media personality, especially in the Black community. I thought there were some interesting moments in that interview. Here's one of them.
One of the biggest allegations against you is that you targeted and locked up thousands of Black men in San Francisco for weed. Some say you did it to boost your career. Some say you did it out of pure hate for Black men. Please tell us the facts. What's the facts of that situation?
It's just simply not true. And what public defenders who are around those days will tell you, I was the most progressive prosecutor in California on marijuana cases.
Now, Charlamagne supports Harris, but both he and some of his guests had some pretty pointed questions for her. What did you think of Harris's performance?
Well, I thought it was an interesting interview for a start. Charlamagne the God covered a lot of ground in that interview. I thought that Harris's answers were okay. I mean, there were no gaffes, to get back to our previous answer. But I did think that sometimes she did fall into that trap of appearing overly scripted. He actually asked her about that, and she said, well, it's called being disciplined. But there is still a question at times of what exactly Kamala Harris authentically believes. And so that clip that you just played about whether she was a progressive prosecutor or not. Even back in 2020 in the Democratic primary campaign, there were voices on the left who were insisting pretty firmly and with some evidence that they did not consider her that progressive.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump is telling Black and Hispanic voters they need to have their heads examined if they vote for Kamala Harris. It comes as polls show Harris's support among Black voters lower than previous Democratic presidential candidates. The same could be said for certain segments of the Latino vote. What do you make of Trump's strategy to outreach for those voter groups?
So, you know, the comment about needing their heads examined, I don't think that's particularly helpful, not only for Trump, but I just don't think it's a very effective political strategy in general to try to hector people into voting for you. But it is certainly the case that polls indicate former President Trump doing better than we would expect with Black and Latino voters by the standards of Republican candidates. I think that's partly an economic appeal. I think it's partly a sort of socially conservative cultural appeal. And also the fact that there does appear to be a bit of a realignment going on in American politics, where working class voters of all races and ethnicities seem to be moving toward the Republican Party, and more affluent, college-educated voters of all ethnicities seem to be moving toward the Democratic Party.
Donald Trump will visit a McDonald's in Pennsylvania this weekend. The Trump campaign says he will work the fryers at a McDonald's in Philadelphia on Sunday, although the exact location has not yet been announced. Trump danced for more than 30 minutes at an event this week. Now he's going to cook French fries. You know, Trump has been at this campaign thing for about 2 years now. Do you think he's just running out of things to do?
I think that Donald Trump sees himself partly as an entertainer, quite honestly. Now, whether that's an appropriate self-image to have when you're a former president and seeking to be the next president of the United States is a whole other debate. Certainly liberals don't find anything funny about it because they see him as somebody who has real authoritarian instincts. But whether it's the dancing or the going to McDonald's or the social media messaging, Trump basically likes to do things that keep attention on him and keep people talking about him. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
Yesterday, Donald Trump sat with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief for a wide-ranging and sometimes feisty interview at work, but Trump's defenders say it's kind of a bargaining technique. What's your take on this?
Yeah, the argument that it's a bargaining technique is, I think, quite difficult to make, because the issue that you alluded to in your question is really important here. Once tariffs are put on, prices go up immediately. Now, Donald Trump's argument is once that happens, it will rebalance the price of imports versus exports and will somehow regenerate the American manufacturing industry. But there's going to be, by almost all economists' estimation, a lot of price pain for American consumers before it gets to that point. So if we assume that those economists are broadly right in their consensus view, then even the usefulness of this as a bargaining chip begins to fall away, because the people on the other side of the bargain know his theory doesn't seem likely to actually work.
Republicans in North Carolina and Florida are struggling to manage misinformation on FEMA's response to Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Many of the false statements spreading on social media are coming from inside the Republican Party, including from former President Trump and his supporters. Some Republican lawmakers are pushing back publicly against the false rumors, but they are hesitant to take on the former president and other right-wing figures who are spreading them. Now, these officials are saying that the rumors are actually doing real damage to these recovery efforts.
Yes, that's right. There have been at least a couple of Republican lawmakers who have come out publicly with statements to that effect. To make a long story short, their concern seems to be that this misinformation, especially about FEMA, is discouraging people from applying for the kind of assistance which they are entitled to and to which they are deserving, given the disaster that has befallen them. So that's the main harm. We have also seen a couple of Republicans push back against colleagues of theirs, like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has come out with all sorts of rather bizarre theories about people controlling the weather for political purposes. So there are at least two strands to this story. But yes, a small number of Republican lawmakers have come out against either Trump or Congresswoman Taylor Greene.
Let's head overseas. The U.S. is ramping up pressure on Israel to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza or risk losing future military aid. But the Biden administration has had little success persuading the Israeli government to change course during the war in Gaza. The Biden administration has given Israel 30 days to comply. Seems pretty convenient to put this deadline just after the election for a president whose party is walking a fine line with voters on this issue.
Yeah, it absolutely does, and it's precisely that point that makes people wonder about the sincerity of this move. If the Biden administration is sincere about the fact that Israel needs to comply with these conditions and needs to increase humanitarian aid to Gaza or have US arms embargoed or shut down, then that would obviously be a very big move. I think the suspicion is that because of the timing, this could be a gambit, perhaps to win voters, particularly in the critical state of Michigan, which has a very large Arab American population, to sort of suggest or give the appearance that the administration is striking a harder line on Israel without really taking any concrete action to that effect.
Yeah, in Lebanon, the latest round of Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 25 people. U.S. officials say Israel has given assurances that to the U.S. that Iranian nuclear facilities and oil sites would not be targeted during this escalation. But what do you make of this expansion of the war between Israel and Iran and its proxies?
Well, I think the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is obviously very, very troublesome, and it has killed, many hundreds, about I think 1,500 people at this stage estimated, and it has also displaced more than 1 million people. Now, of course, the other side of that argument is that Hezbollah is firing rockets into Israel. But the broader picture here, Drew, is one where tensions are still escalating. It's true that we're seeing those reports about the Israelis purportedly promising not to strike Iranian nuclear or oil facilities, but the overall climate in the region is clearly very, very troubled, and nobody can predict with exact certainty where it's going to go next.
All right, Niall Stanage, appreciate your insight. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Weeks after Hurricane Helene paved a path of destruction through the Southeast, misinformation and conspiracy theories have spread online, causing panic and even threats against FEMA, which has led to one man's arrest in North Carolina. The federal agency has resumed door-to-door outreach after pausing aid in parts of the state over the reported threats. NewsNation correspondent Rich McHugh is on the ground in North Carolina, taking a first-hand look at what officials are doing to combat the misinformation and their next steps in the recovery process.
Yeah, FEMA now has 4 disaster recovery centers here in western North Carolina. This area just devastated by Hurricane Helene. They say they have approved disaster assistance for 75,000 households, but there's a lot of confusion about FEMA, armed militias, and the situation here in western North Carolina. FEMA says misinformation is putting its people in jeopardy, though volunteer aid groups say the misinformation is coming top down from FEMA. Over the weekend, the national media reported on threats from armed militias to FEMA. One North Carolina resident, William Parsons, was arrested after posting a message on Facebook calling for people to overtake the FEMA site in nearby Lake Lure. Parsons claimed FEMA was withholding supplies from hurricane survivors.
We the people are sick and tired of the BS. We the people are seeking volunteers to join us to overtake the FEMA site in Lake Lure and send the products up the mountains this Saturday.
Now, after his arrest, Parsons says law enforcement agents who arrested him are lying.
They want to sit here and lie, say that I'm carrying guns around. I had one gun on me, which was legally owned and seen on the side of my pocket, on my hip. And I had a rifle and another pistol that were in my vehicle that were both lawful and legal to own.
FEMA says they made operational changes to keep personnel safe. And yesterday, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell had a very specific message.
I need everyone listening to hear this from me. The ongoing spread of misinformation about operations is not okay. It has got to stop. The federal family has been here, working side by side with the state since day one. These are people who put their lives on hold to help those who have lost everything.
But Adam Smith, who leads the volunteer organization called Savage Ops, it's a group of former Special Operations Forces, says the rumors about armed militias are directed at groups like theirs, and the threats are hurting their ability to get aid into the community.
The misinformation is not coming from the ground up. I think the misinformation is coming from the top of FEMA down. When you have contractors that are afraid to go out into the areas they're supposed to work and they're saying you have to carry, you have to pack, or watch out, people are going to come after you, it's not true. The people in the mountains might be suspicious of the government in general, but they're the most warm, welcoming people that you could possibly imagine.
Now, Smith says they are working with the National Guard, state authorities, and congressmen. They have their support. They simply want to help the community get back on its feet, and they're not going anywhere. Drew?
Thank you, Rich McHugh. As residents across the South begin to rebuild after the destruction caused by Hurricanes Milton and Helene, residents in Florida continue to build in high-risk areas. The state has built 77,000 new properties in high-risk flood areas since 2019, skyrocketing insurance bills and forcing top insurers to pull back on coverage in the state. Joining us now from Florida is NewsNation correspondent Brooke Schaefer with a closer look at the state's building trend.
Right now, more than 16 million people in Florida live in coastal counties, and that number continues to grow despite the risk of hurricanes and flooding. An analysis by the climate modeling firm First Street Foundation found that Florida actually built 77,000 new properties in high-risk flood areas since 2019, the most in the nation. That same analysis found that nationally, close to 300,000 new properties were built in high-risk flood areas from 2019 through 2023. And these numbers have become especially concerning for some, including a disaster risk reduction expert who said in many states, we are a good-sized hurricane away from breaking the entire insurance system.
We got to a situation in our country that while we don't lose as many lives in storms, though Helene unfortunately was an outlier in that regard, our losses are rising because we have more people coming to the coasts, and we have therefore grown our exposure to these storms, and we have a climate that's changing. That's going to be, regrettably, no pun intended, the perfect storm that is probably going to require us to reimagine insurance, maybe in painful ways, and to start having more candid discussions about retreat. Because there will be, for some families, very little possibility of insuring or building to withstand what might be coming.
FEMA recently looked at severe repetitive loss properties. It's a designation that covers homes that have severely flooded more than once, and they found that there are 45,000 of these properties in the U.S. At the end of 2022, about 3,100 of those severe loss properties were in Florida alone. Ratings firm Morningstar DBRS, in a report released this week, said it expects Hurricane Milton to be among the top 5 costliest natural catastrophes in the U.S., with insured losses approaching $60 billion. Experts now warning that we have gotten ourselves into a difficult situation with the insurance companies, saying that we need to build better before the storm. Back to you.
Thank you, NewsNation's Brooke Schaefer. The owner of the dog, found tied to a pole shortly before Hurricane Milton made landfall in a heartbreaking viral video, has been arrested.
I'm proud to announce that the authorities have identified the dog's former owners, and State Attorney Susie Lopez is now pursuing animal cruelty charges against the individual. So,
Giovanni Garcia will be charged with aggravated animal cruelty, which is a third-degree felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Garcia allegedly tied his dog to a pole along Interstate 75, claiming he abandoned the dog while on his way to Georgia because he couldn't find anyone to pick up the dog. The dog, nicknamed Trooper after being found by a Florida Highway Patrol trooper, is currently in the care of the Leon County Humane Society. And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.